Claire, smile a little, my husband whispered without even looking at me as the waiter placed another round of bourbon glasses on the table. You look like you're attending a funeral. His friends laughed softly, the kind of polished laughter people use in expensive restaurants when they want to humiliate someone without sounding cruel. The steakhouse smelled like burnt butter and oak smoke, and I remember staring at the reflection of the chandelier trembling inside my water glass while Ethan leaned back in his chair and said, "Honestly, I think I made a mistake marrying someone this plain." Jason nearly choked on his drink. One of the wives looked down at her lap, and Ethan just kept going. "Claire's a good person," he added with a shrug. "But she's not exactly the woman I pictured beside me at this stage of my life." My fingers tightened around the cloth napkin so hard my wedding ring pressed into my skin. Then his mother, Linda, reached across the table and patted my wrist like I was a child. "You have to understand, sweetheart," she said softly. "A successful man needs a woman who can keep up socially." I smiled anyway. I actually smiled, and that seemed to make them all more comfortable. Before I tell you what happened after that dinner changed my entire life, I just want to say something quickly. If this story truly resonates with you, if you've ever felt invisible inside your own family, I'd really appreciate you liking the video and subscribing to the channel, but only if this story speaks to your heart. And wherever you're watching from tonight, leave your city, your country, and your local time in the comments. I always read them before bed. My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 33 years old, and the night my husband called me embarrassing in front of his friends was the beginning of the end of our marriage, although none of them knew that yet. Looking back now, I think the cruelest part wasn't what Ethan said at the table. It was how normal it felt. Because humiliation in our marriage never arrived all at once. It came quietly, through little things. The way he stopped introducing me properly at corporate events. The way he corrected me in conversations even when I was right. The way he bought me neutral-colored dresses because he once told me bright colors looked too loud on me. By the time we drove home that night in his black Range Rover, the silence between us felt older than the marriage itself. Rain tapped against the windshield while downtown Chicago blurred past the windows in silver streaks. Ethan loosened his tie with one hand and sighed like he was the exhausted one. "You could have tried harder tonight," he muttered. I turned slowly toward him. Tried harder at what? He kept his eyes on the road. Being more engaging. More polished. Jason's wife can talk to investors for an hour without sounding awkward. I nodded once and looked back out the window. "All right," I said quietly. That single word seemed to relax him more than any argument would have. He thought my silence meant surrender. He had no idea that while he slept beside me later that night, I was sitting alone on the kitchen floor at 2:14 in the morning, staring at an email draft I had opened 3 times and never sent. And at the top of that email was the name of a law firm Ethan had never heard me mention before. The truth is, I learned how to become invisible long before I married Ethan. I grew up in a small gray house outside Milwaukee where everything in our family revolved around my older brother, Daniel. If Daniel scored a touchdown, my father took the whole family out for burgers. If I brought home straight A report cards, my mother would smile distractedly and say, "That is nice, honey," without even looking up from the sink. By the time I was 13, I already understood that being low maintenance made adults love you more. One December, my parents spent nearly $400 on a new guitar for Daniel because he wanted to start a band with his friends. On Christmas morning, I opened a box of discounted bath towels because my mother said practical gifts built character. I still remember forcing a smile while Daniel laughed and said, "Claire probably likes boring stuff anyway." Nobody corrected him. Nobody ever did. Even at family dinners, I was treated like background noise. My father would ask Daniel about football practice, college plans, girls' dreams. Then he would glance at me and say things like, "Claire is easy. She never asks for much." At 16, I got accepted into an advanced business program in Chicago. I came running into the kitchen holding the envelope so tightly my hands shook. "Mom, they only accepted 12 students statewide." She barely looked over. "That is wonderful, sweetheart, but can you help set the table first? Your brother has a game tonight." Years later, when Ethan first met my family, he noticed it immediately. On the drive home, he laughed softly and squeezed my hand across the center console. "You know what I like about you," he said. "You are calm. No drama. No ego. At the time it sounded like love. I did not realize he was complimenting the exact thing that made it easier for people to overlook me. Around 3 that morning after the dinner at the steakhouse, I walked quietly into my home office with a cup of cold coffee and opened a locked drawer I had not touched in years. Under old tax folders and legal pads sat a navy blue binder with my maiden name printed across the front in silver ink. And inside that binder was something Ethan had never seen before. I opened the binder slowly, careful not to wake Ethan sleeping upstairs. The pages smelled faintly like old paper and printer ink, and for a second I just sat there staring at my own maiden name on contracts I had not looked at in almost 4 years. Claire Bennett. Not Claire Whitmore. Not somebody's wife. Just me. Inside were expansion plans, investor notes, operational flowcharts, and an original partnership agreement from the startup Ethan now bragged about at every networking dinner in Chicago. Back then, the company had been nothing more than 3 folding tables in a rented office above a frozen yogurt shop in River North. Ethan liked to tell people he built everything from scratch. That was not exactly true. At 8:30 the next morning, I walked into Whitmore Dynamics wearing the same cream sweater I always wore on Fridays, carrying the same leather tote, smiling at the same receptionist who barely looked up from her phone. Morning, Claire. Morning, Tina. Nobody noticed anything different about me. That was the strange part. My entire life could be quietly collapsing, and people would still assume I was simply the supportive wife bringing coffee into conference rooms. Around noon, Ethan stopped by my office doorway while texting someone. Mom invited us to dinner Sunday, he said distractedly. Try not to wear anything too plain this time. Normally, I would have laughed softly and pretended the comment did not sting. Normally, I would have made excuses for him in my head. Stress, pressure, ego. But this time I looked up from my laptop and said very calmly, "Then maybe you should stop inviting me." He actually blinked, like he did not recognize the person speaking. "What is that supposed to mean?" he asked. "Nothing," I said, turning back to my screen. But my pulse was moving hard under my skin because for the first time in years, I had not rushed to make him comfortable again. That afternoon, an email arrived from a Chicago investment group confirming final review for the acquisition meeting scheduled the following week. Ethan had no idea I was copied on it. No idea my signature was still required before the deal could close. And as I stared at the message glowing against my computer screen, my phone suddenly buzzed with a text from someone I had not heard from in nearly 2 years. Amelia Carter, the attorney. "Claire," the message read, "I think it is time we finally talk. Amelia asked me to meet her at a quiet coffee shop on Wabash Avenue just after 6. Outside, the sidewalks were wet from freezing rain, and downtown Chicago glowed silver under the streetlights. I spotted her immediately through the window, sitting straight-backed in a charcoal coat with a legal folder resting beside her untouched tea. "You look tired," she said gently when I sat down. I laughed once under my breath. "That obvious?" Amelia studied me for a moment before sliding the folder across the table. "Claire, before we talk about anything else, I need to ask you something honestly. Did Ethan ever tell you he changed the ownership filings last year?" The words did not even register at first. "What filings?" She opened the folder carefully and turned one document toward me. There it was. Whitmore Dynamics. Revised executive structure. Ethan Whitmore listed as majority operational authority. My stomach tightened. "That is not possible," I whispered. "I never signed off on this." Amelia's eyes softened in the way people look at someone standing too close to the edge of something terrible. "That is why I called you." The espresso machine hissed loudly behind us while my hands turned cold around the paper cup. Suddenly small moments from the past year started replaying differently in my head. Ethan insisting I skip legal review dinners because they were boring. Ethan bringing documents home already tabbed with sticky notes where he wanted signatures. Ethan kissing my forehead while saying, "Just sign here, babe, it is routine." I felt sick. "He used me," I said quietly, more to myself than to Amelia. "Not exactly," she replied carefully. "He buried you." The next morning at the office, everything felt wrong. Conversations stopped when I walked into rooms. 2 executives glanced at each other near the elevators before quickly looking away. Then around noon, Jason stepped into my office with an awkward smile and shut the door behind him. Claire, he said slowly, there are rumors going around that Ethan is preparing for a major leadership announcement after the acquisition closes. I stared at him. What kind of announcement? Jason hesitated. People think he is restructuring the company. Restructuring how? He exhaled hard. Without you. The room suddenly sounded very far away. The heating vents. Keyboards clicking. Phones ringing somewhere down the hall. And then my computer screen lit up with a new company-wide calendar invite from Ethan himself. Mandatory executive meeting. Monday morning. Final transition presentation. By Friday afternoon, the entire company already seemed to know a version of my future that I had never agreed to. People who used to stop by my office suddenly kept conversations short. One assistant accidentally forwarded me an internal scheduling thread before unsending it 30 seconds later. But I still saw the subject line. Post-transition leadership dinner. Not one mention of my name anywhere in the chain. Around 4, I received an email from Human Resources asking me to update my long-term role preferences within the evolving organizational structure. The wording was so polished it almost sounded kind. Almost. I stared at the screen while the city darkened outside my office windows, and snow began drifting slowly across Michigan Avenue. Then my phone buzzed. Ethan. I let it ring twice before answering. Hey, he said casually like nothing was happening. You left before breakfast. I had work. You sound upset. I almost laughed at that. Should I not be? Silence stretched between us for a second. Then he sighed softly. Claire, companies evolve. People evolve. Sometimes leadership has to look a certain way after acquisition. Leadership. Not partnership. Not marriage. Leadership. Did you tell them I was stepping back? I asked quietly. I may have implied you wanted less responsibility. The words landed heavier than yelling would have. Outside my office, someone rolled a cart down the hallway, the wheels rattling against tile while my entire chest felt strangely hollow. Why would you do that? I whispered. Ethan lowered his voice like he was trying to calm a difficult situation. Because investors trust consistency. You hate public attention anyway. I was protecting you. Protecting me. That night he sent flowers to the condo. White orchids. My favorite. There was a handwritten card tucked inside. We are still a team. Let me handle this. Love, Ethan. I left the flowers untouched on the kitchen counter until the petals started curling brown at the edges 2 days later. Saturday morning brought 3 voicemails from Linda. Sweetheart. Ethan is under enormous pressure right now. You need to stop overthinking business decisions. A supportive wife knows when to stand beside her husband. By Sunday, even my own mother called after hearing rumors through mutual friends in Milwaukee. Claire, she said carefully, sometimes men just need to feel important. I sat alone on the edge of the guest room bed after the call ended, staring at the framed skyline photo hanging crooked above the dresser. Every person around me seemed more invested in protecting Ethan's image than asking whether I was all right. And somewhere between the unanswered emails, the carefully worded lies, and the silence filling every room of our home, I realized something terrifying. I had disappeared so gradually inside this marriage that people no longer noticed when I was being erased. Monday morning arrived cold and colorless. Chicago looked washed out beneath low clouds, the lake hidden behind sheets of gray fog. I sat alone in the executive conference room 20 minutes early, listening to the soft hum of the projector, while condensation slid down the side of my untouched coffee cup. One by one, people entered carrying tablets and legal pads, speaking in low professional voices that stopped whenever they glanced at me. Ethan arrived last. Navy suit, silver tie, calm smile. He looked rested, like someone walking into a future already prepared for him. Morning, he said lightly as he took the chair across from me. I nodded once. That was all I had left to give him. The presentation started at 9 sharp. Growth projections, acquisition language, market expansion. Slide after slide filled the wall while investors joined remotely from New York and San Francisco. Then Ethan stepped forward near the end and said the sentence that finally made everything inside me go still. As part of the company's next phase, Claire will be transitioning into a more private advisory role moving forward. Private advisory role. The room stayed quiet for 2 full seconds before polite applause started. Someone near the far end of the table even smiled sympathetically at me like I was retiring after a long illness. I felt my own heartbeat in my throat. Ethan continued speaking smoothly, thanking teams, discussing leadership alignment, talking about strategic continuity. And suddenly I understood something with terrifying clarity. This was never one lie. It was hundreds of tiny edits to reality repeated over years until everyone believed them. Even me. After the meeting, people avoided eye contact while packing their laptops. Jason paused near the door. "Claire," he started softly, but he could not finish the sentence. I just shook my head. It is okay. But it was not okay. By late afternoon I found myself driving north without thinking, crossing familiar streets until I pulled into the cemetery outside Evanston where my grandfather was buried. The wind coming off Lake Michigan cut through my coat while dead winter grass bent softly around the headstones. My grandfather had been the only person in my family who never asked me to become smaller. Do not disappear just because other people are loud, he used to tell me while fixing old radios in his garage. I stood there for a long time with freezing hands tucked into my sleeves, staring at his name carved into stone. Then quietly, for the first time in years, I admitted the truth out loud. "I do not think my husband ever really loved me," I whispered. The words hurt less than I expected. Maybe because deep down I had already known. My phone buzzed in my pocket just as the sky began turning dark over the lake. An email notification. Sender, Amelia Carter. Subject line. "The documents are ready whenever you are." And standing there in the cold beside the only person who had ever truly seen me, I realized I was finally ready to stop asking for permission to exist. The next 2 weeks passed quietly on the surface. Quiet enough that Ethan seemed relieved. He stopped trying to explain things and started acting like the difficult period between us had already settled itself. Meanwhile, I met Amelia 3 times in her downtown office overlooking the river, signing documents while snow drifted past the windows in slow white sheets. The first thing she told me was, "You need copies of everything before this acquisition closes." So I made copies. Contracts. Original partnership agreements. Early investor emails from 12 years ago, when Whitmore Dynamics had been nothing but an idea and unpaid overtime. Every night after Ethan fell asleep, I sat at the dining table beneath the dim pendant light scanning files into encrypted folders, while the dishwasher hummed softly in the background. Felt strange at first. Not dramatic. Not empowering. Just necessary. One Tuesday morning I walked into a small conference room on the 23rd floor to meet with 2 acquisition attorneys from Chicago Equity Partners. Neither of them looked older than 40. Both of them stood when I entered. "Miss Bennett," one of them said immediately, using my maiden name from the original filings. "We have been hoping to finally meet you in person." For a second I just stared at him. Then I sat down slowly and opened my notebook. They did not speak to me like someone decorative. They asked detailed questions about infrastructure scaling, licensing structure, operational design. Real questions. The kind Ethan had stopped asking me years ago because he assumed he already knew who I was. When the meeting ended, one attorney smiled and said, "Honestly, your systems are the reason this acquisition moved forward at all." I drove home afterward through evening traffic with tears burning unexpectedly behind my eyes, not because of the compliment itself, but because I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen clearly. At home, Ethan was standing in the kitchen scrolling through his phone while reheated pasta spun inside the microwave. "You missed dinner with my parents again," he said without looking up. "Linda thinks you are pulling away from the family." I set my keys down quietly beside the fruit bowl. "Maybe I am." He finally looked at me then, confused by the answer. But before he could say anything else, my phone buzzed on the counter with a new email notification from Chicago Equity Partners. Subject line. Final approval confirmed. Closing scheduled Friday morning. And for the first time in a very long time, the future no longer felt like something happening to me. It felt like something waiting for me. Friday morning began before sunrise. I stood alone in the elevator of the Langford building downtown, watching the numbers climb toward the 42nd floor while soft jazz played through hidden speakers above me. My reflection in the mirrored wall looked unfamiliar somehow. Black wool coat. Structured cream blouse. hair pulled back neatly at the nape of my neck. Calm eyes. Not smaller. Not apologizing. When the elevator doors opened, a receptionist immediately stood from behind a marble desk. Good morning, Miss Bennett, she said warmly. Conference room A is ready for you. Miss Bennett. The name settled over me strangely after years of hearing myself introduced only as Ethan's wife. Inside the boardroom, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Chicago River turning pale gold beneath the winter sunrise. Legal teams shuffled papers. Coffee steamed from silver carafes. A long blue folder rested at the center of my seat with a printed nameplate beside it. Claire Bennett, Founding Operations Architect. I stared at the title for a second longer than necessary. One of the senior partners noticed and smiled. You earned it, he said simply. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. Contracts finalized. Equity structures confirmed. Operational transition approved unanimously. At one point an investor from New York leaned back in his chair and asked, "How did you build a scaling system this stable without major collapse during expansion?" And for the first time in years, I answered without softening myself first. Because I built it to survive pressure, I said calmly. Nobody interrupted me. Nobody explained my own work back to me. After signing the final documents, the room broke into applause. Not loud, not dramatic, just genuine. Later that afternoon, I walked through the lobby carrying a slim leather portfolio, while employees from Chicago Equity Partners nodded respectfully as I passed. Outside, cold wind rushed between the buildings, lifting strands of hair loose from my coat collar while taxis splashed through slushy intersections below. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Ethan. I let it ring once before answering. Hey, he said distractedly. Jason just told me investors are suddenly asking about you this morning. Do you know what that is about? I looked up at my reflection in the dark glass windows across the street. For the first time in years, I recognized the woman looking back at me. I think, I said quietly, they are finally asking the right questions. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then somewhere behind Ethan's voice, faint and rushed, I heard Jason say something sharp enough to make Ethan suddenly stop breathing. And in that exact moment, 11 days after the dinner where everything began unraveling, the future finally caught up with the lie he had built around me. By the time I arrived home that evening, the condo lights were already on. Through the living room windows overlooking the river, I could see Ethan pacing slowly with his phone pressed against his ear. The moment I stepped inside, he turned toward me too fast. Claire, he said sharply, ending the call mid-sentence. His face looked different somehow. Tight around the eyes. Controlled but barely. I hung my coat carefully by the door. You left work early? I asked. Jason got a call from the acquisition attorneys. He replied immediately. Why are they suddenly reviewing original formation documents? I said nothing at first. The dishwasher hummed softly behind us while traffic lights flickered red across the wet streets below. Ethan took 2 slow steps closer. Claire, what exactly have you been doing? There it was. Not concern. Not apology. Fear. For years, I had watched him control every room simply by speaking confidently enough. But now his voice carried something unfamiliar underneath it. Uncertainty. I walked past him into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water before answering. Fixing a few things. Fixing. He let out a nervous laugh that sounded forced even to him. Jason says investors are asking who actually built the operational structure. I turned toward him calmly. And what did you tell them? Ethan opened his mouth then stopped. Because suddenly there was no safe version of the story left. His phone started vibrating again across the marble counter. Jason. He ignored it. Then it rang again immediately. You should answer that, I said quietly. Ethan grabbed the phone this time. What? He snapped the second he answered. I watched his expression shift while Jason spoke. First confusion. Then disbelief. Then something colder. That is impossible, Ethan whispered. Silence. No, she would have told me. Another silence. His eyes slowly lifted toward mine across the kitchen. Jason was still talking loudly enough now that I could hear fragments through the speaker. The original filings still list her. Investors are furious. Legal says the transition cannot happen without her approval. Ethan looked like someone realizing the floor beneath him was never stable to begin with. Upstairs, somewhere in another unit, faint piano music drifted through the ceiling, while the city glowed dark blue beyond the windows. Finally, Ethan ended the call with shaking fingers. "Claire," he said carefully, almost cautiously now, "what is going on?" I set my glass down beside the sink and met his eyes for the first time without shrinking away from what he might see there. Then I reached into my leather portfolio, pulled out the original signed partnership agreement with my name printed across the top, and placed it gently on the counter between us. Ethan stared down at the agreement for so long that the silence itself started to feel heavy. The kitchen lights reflected off the paper between us while snow drifted quietly outside the windows behind him. Finally he looked up. "Why does this say Founding Operations Architect?" he asked carefully. "Because that was my role." His jaw tightened. "Claire, I know you helped in the early years, but this—" "I did not help," I interrupted softly. "I built the system your company still runs on." He blinked like the sentence physically hurt to hear. Then he picked up the agreement with both hands and started flipping through pages faster now, scanning signatures, legal seals, percentage structures. "No," he muttered under his breath. "No, this cannot be right." I walked to the dining table and opened my laptop without rushing. One by one, I pulled up archived licensing approvals, investor correspondence, infrastructure patents filed under my maiden name. Ethan kept staring at the screen while the color slowly drained from his face. "You never told me," he whispered. I looked at him calmly across the room. "You never asked." His phone started buzzing again. This time it was his mother. He answered automatically, still distracted. "Mom, not now." But Linda's voice carried sharply through the speaker. "Ethan, what is happening? Richard from the board just called your father asking about Claire's authority in the acquisition." Ethan closed his eyes. Briefly. "I am handling it." "Handling what?" she demanded. "Who exactly is she to this company?" For the first time since I had known her, Linda sounded uncertain. Ethan looked at me slowly across the kitchen island while I remained standing there in silence. Then I answered her myself. I designed the operational structure before Ethan ever hired his first executive team. Silence. I could hear Linda breathing faintly on the other end. "Claire," she finally said, almost cautiously now. "The investors requested my approval this morning because legally they still need it," I continued evenly. "Without my signature, the acquisition does not move forward." Ethan lowered himself slowly into one of the kitchen chairs like his legs no longer trusted him. Upstairs, pipes rattled softly somewhere in the building, while the refrigerator hummed behind us. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The truth itself was loud enough. Then Ethan looked back at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not superiority. Not irritation. Recognition. Real recognition. Like he was meeting me for the first time after years of living beside someone he never bothered to understand. And quietly, almost like he was afraid of the answer, he asked, "How much of this company is actually yours?" 38%, I answered quietly. Ethan stared at me across the kitchen table like the number itself had changed the shape of the room. "No," he said immediately, shaking his head once. "That is not possible." I opened another folder from my portfolio and slid several documents toward him. Original equity allocations. Updated filings from each investment round. Legal confirmations signed years before our marriage even happened. Every page carried dates, signatures, notarized seals. Nothing dramatic. Just facts. Ethan looked down at the paperwork with trembling hands while his phone continued vibrating beside him unanswered. "You own almost half the company," he whispered. "I owned it before I became your wife." That sentence seemed to land harder than anything else. Around 7 the next morning, Linda arrived at the condo without warning. I opened the door to find her, standing there in a camel wool coat, her expression unusually tight. "Can we talk privately?" she asked softly. For years I would have stepped aside immediately, eager to keep peace inside the family. This time I remained standing in the doorway for a second before answering. "You can come in for 10 minutes. She noticed the difference instantly. Inside, she sat carefully at the kitchen island while snow tapped lightly against the windows behind her. "Claire," she began, folding her gloves slowly, "if there has been some misunderstanding." "There has not." Her eyes flickered downward briefly. Ethan says the investors are restructuring the agreement now. Because they legally have to. Linda exhaled quietly. You should have told us who you were. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. I did. Nobody listened long enough to hear it. The kitchen fell silent after that. No yelling. No denial. Just the uncomfortable sound of reality settling into place. Later that afternoon, Ethan came home early carrying takeout containers from my favorite Italian restaurant downtown. A peace offering. He set them carefully on the counter while avoiding my eyes. I know I handled things badly, he said. But we can still fix this. I watched steam rise slowly from the unopened containers between us. Fix what exactly? He finally looked up then, and for the first time I could see genuine panic beneath his composure. Us, he said quietly. I leaned back against the counter and crossed my arms gently. Ethan, you built an entire version of our marriage where I existed in the background because it made you feel larger. That was never love. His face tightened like he wanted to argue, but deep down he already knew it was true. Outside, headlights moved across the snow-covered streets below while the city settled into evening. And standing there in the kitchen we had shared for 7 years, I realized something unexpected. I was no longer angry, but I was also no longer willing to disappear for someone else's comfort again. 6 months later, my life looked quieter from the outside. Smaller, maybe, to people who only measured success through appearances. I moved into a lakefront apartment on the north side of Chicago with wide windows, old hardwood floors, and a kitchen that finally felt peaceful when I stood inside it at night. There were no tense dinners anymore. No careful editing of myself before speaking. No silence heavy with performance. Just stillness. The acquisition closed 3 weeks after Ethan and I separated. The final number ended up slightly higher than projected, and for the first time in company history, my name appeared publicly beside the operational architecture that built Whitmore Dynamics into what it became. Not because I demanded recognition, because legally and professionally, the truth could no longer be removed from the story. Ethan and I finalized the divorce quietly that spring. No screaming. No courtroom drama. Just signatures, paperwork, and 2 people finally forced to face what the marriage had actually become. The strange part was this. Once the pretending stopped, I did not hate him anymore. I think some people spend so much time trying to feel important that they stop noticing who they are standing beside. And some of us spend so much time being easy to love that we slowly become invisible to ourselves. A few weeks ago, Jason called me after a bored dinner downtown. People talk about you differently now, he admitted. I smiled softly into the phone while watching snow fall outside my living room window. That is because I finally talk about myself differently now. Sometimes healing is not loud. Sometimes it is just waking up one morning and realizing your nervous system no longer feels like it is bracing for disappointment. It is drinking coffee in silence without fear. It is making decisions without apologizing first. It is learning that boundaries are not cruelty. They are self-respect with a calm voice. If someone listening to my story tonight feels trapped inside a relationship, a family, or a version of yourself that keeps asking you to shrink, I want you to hear me carefully. You do not need permission to take your own life seriously. Protect your finances. Read what you sign. Listen to your intuition when something feels wrong, even if everybody around you keeps telling you to stay quiet for the sake of peace. Real love does not require you to disappear in order to be accepted. And sometimes God or the universe or whatever you believe in will allow the truth to stay hidden only until you are finally strong enough to survive seeing it clearly. Last Sunday, I visited my grandfather's grave again just before sunset. I brought fresh white lilies and stood there while cold wind moved softly through the cemetery trees. Before leaving, I slipped my old wedding ring into the pocket of my coat, looked out across the frozen lake, and realized I no longer felt like someone abandoned. I felt like someone returned to herself. My name is Claire Bennett. I am 33 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never become smaller just to make someone else feel bigger. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Truly, if any part of it touched something quiet inside your heart, I hope you remember that you are not difficult for wanting respect, honesty, and peace. And if you feel comfortable, leave a comment sharing where you are watching from tonight and what time it is there. I read more of them than you probably realize. If this story resonated with you, you can subscribe and stay for the next one. There are more stories in this playlist about family, betrayal, healing, and the quiet moments that change a person forever. Some endings are painful, some are hopeful, but all of them begin the same way, with someone finally deciding they deserve better than silence.